Hello everyone, and welcome to the first RGB RPGs DM guide. My name is Sean, aka Comet, and I run 5 to 6 games of Dungeons & Dragons a week for anywhere between 25 and 30 different players. Today we're going to go over the prep document that I'll be referencing through many of the different videos that I do, especially any sort of prep breakdown videos that I'll be doing for the sessions I run. Seems like a natural place to start, as I'll be referencing this document pretty often, and it is hands down the most important tool that I use. The concepts and the guidelines that you'll be seeing here are heavily influenced off of Sly Flourish's Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, as well as, of course, Sly Flourish's The Lazy Dungeon Master. Those are invaluable resources. I recommend that anyone interested in dungeon mastering checks that out. So, the concept behind those books are prep only what you need. The less prep you can do, the better off that you'll do, and be ready to improv at the table using your prep and your notes as a guide, as sort of the framework that you can build off of. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Of course, we have the game's name and when it's going to be. That's important information for me as I run so many games, but if you're only running the one, then just put the game's name up there. But then we have our checklist. That is the number one thing that you want to look at before you run any session. And make sure that you've done at least a little bit for each one of these check marks. Review the characters, create a strong start, outline the paths that lie ahead, design the key points of those outlines, outline important NPCs, describe locations, choose potential foes, select music and sounds, and then select magic item rewards. So some of these things will be more important than others in certain sessions, and whether you'll be running a module, a homebrew, whether you're running a one-shot or a long-term campaign, this document can still help out a lot, and these practices can still work out for any one of those. So, the first thing that you want to do is you want to review the players. The single most important thing of any game of Dungeons & Dragons is the players. Everyone wants to be having fun at the table, and there's a lot of players, and you want to make sure that each of them is getting what they want out of the game, or as close to it as you can deliver. So, I like to put the character, the player of that character, and then a few key points for each of them. Their backgrounds, their motivations, and their desires. That list is the bare bones start, and then that grows as it goes. I've had my players document have 15, 20 bullet points. That may be a bit excessive, but it shows that you're invested in your characters, and that you know who your characters are. And one of the big things that they teach in Sly Flourish's book is, do you know the names of each of your players' characters? If you forget any of their names, you might want to re-look at how much investment you're putting into knowing your characters. So, know the names of your characters, be able to list them off the top of your head, and then of course know what they want out of the game. We have our session introduction. It's just one or two sentences about how the session begins. The players step out of Castle Ravenloft. The world ahead of them, Strahd still lying behind them. Something like that. Or players wander through the woods, lost for the third day in a row. The rain still pours. Basic things like that. And then of course, when in doubt, start with the combat. The players trek through the woods, the rain still pours. Footsteps can be heard in the distance. You're surrounded. Roll initiative. Excellent way to start games. So that's a super important thing. How are you going to start this game? How are you going to take this group from a bunch of people sitting around the table to a bunch of people playing Dungeons & Dragons? Next up, the real meat of these prep notes. The real reference point that you may look back to throughout the game, and the real parts that you want solid of your game. I like to break these down into two different categories, two different possibilities for each note, but at the end of the day, you don't want any less than 10 bullet points in total, no more than 15. Less than 10, and you haven't really set yourself up for enough situations, for enough content. More than 15, and you may find yourselves rushing through certain things to get to other parts. So I found that 10 to 15 is a good middle ground. 10 is the perfect number. If you're going to go over 10, don't go over 15. So the bullet points. A major event. The party is attacked while wandering through the woods. Then a bunch of info on those different things that happen within that one event. Um, Several zombies have been let loose from a local cemetery, the rain washing their corpses to the surface and magical energies nearby reanimating them. Things like that. And then other notes underneath that. The source of the zombies can be traced back to that overflown graveyard with so-and-so check. Small little bullet points to outline a specific event. You don't want to go over more than a sentence or two per bullet point. Keep it simple, keep it concise. Less is more with DM prep. And then there's standalone notes. Once the zombie threat is dealt with, the players may notice a nearby village. If the that could be one whole bullet point right there, and then so on and so forth like that. Basically, keep your thoughts to the point, keep them concise, and just try to get to that 10 bullet point mark. Sometimes you'll go over, but don't go over by too much. Then, of course, we want to outline our NPCs. NPCs are a super important part of any game. They are the central aspect, aside from your players, of any social interactions that you're going to be doing, which, as we talked about in the first video, a pillar of D&D is social interaction. So NPCs are super important. I like to separate my NPCs into major NPCs and minor NPCs. With major NPCs getting their name, their character archetype, who in popular culture I like to base that image on. Again, ideas drawn from the Lazy Dungeon Master series. So, for example, Lady Katha Mossblossom, agent of the Lord's Alliance in Waterdeep. Her character archetype could be Catelyn Stark from Game of Thrones. Relevant stat block. And then several notes about that NPC. Key features, a physical feature or two. How does she hold herself? A key important note of her past. Something along those lines. And do that for whatever major NPCs are going to be involved. Minor NPC, I leave a name, a brief physical description, and then a line or two, or a sentence or two about that NPC. Nothing too major. A lot of times, minor NPCs can be thought up on the fly. There's loads and loads of awesome random name generators online. Check those out. They're great for random NPCs. Next up would be notable locations. So, with notable locations, I run a lot of modules. So a lot of my locations are built in, and I talk about them briefly when I do my key points. But if you're doing a homebrew, these can be super important. The place's name, something that catches the player's attention and immediately puts an image in their mind, is also important. The Hill of Bones, an ancient graveyard of dragons, ancient chromatic dragons that have brought all of their victims here and made a mound out of all their bones. So an evocative name and then a sentence or two describing that place, at least for your notable locations. Next up, we have relevant stat blocks. It's kind of self-explanatory. Any stat blocks that you may need, list them off, go over them. A lot of DMs, me included, the stat blocks and being able to engage characters with those stat blocks and with those creatures is one of my favorite parts of the game. So this is a super important spot. So that way I'm not looking forward to running this creature, but then I realize, oh, I really only glanced over this stat block and now I need to slow the game down to look at things. Write them down here, look over them, make sure that you're familiar, especially with the major creatures that are going to be involved, things that are more complex. Next up is the items and rewards. There's a couple steps before this when we're going down our checklist, but the music selection is something that we take care of off screen. Whether you're using Roll20's built-in audio, whether you're using YouTube at a home game, or whatever it may be, the right music can really set the scene, and the right music lets your players know what kind of atmosphere you're trying to set up. Super helpful for that. So selecting music is always worth at least a few minutes of your time during prep. And then we have our items and rewards. Players love magic items. Players love to get things. They love to feel like what they just went through was worth something, that they got something out of it. They don't always have to be super powerful artifacts or magic items, just like a simple thing that they got out of what they just did. Make sure that you give them something for the feats that they achieve. And that's this section. write the item down, then a couple bullet points of where they find it, how they could find it, what it does, or if it ties into the story somehow. So that is the real main part of my prep template list here, of my prep template. I use it in every single game. Sometimes it changes, sometimes it evolves, but I use it in all of them. So after all of that is said and done, if we're running a homebrew campaign, or if I have an idea of a couple arcs that I want the game to go through, I'll leave those kind of notes here. And the last section right down there is where we would put any game-specific notes, any, oh, something weird just happened, wasn't expecting that, should take that down. This is where I would do that. So the entirety of my prep process for any given game takes anywhere from an hour to 2 hours per session, using this document, filling in all these different things, and then of course through Roll20 or setting up battle maps, wherever it may be. Having a clear idea of how you're going to set up your games can really help out a lot in keeping yourself from getting overwhelmed and keeping you from over prepping, which is entirely a thing that you can do. You could spend hours and hours and hours prepping something that the players never even interact with, which is terrible, and it kind of encourages DMs to push players towards something that they spent forever working on because they don't want to miss it. If you're only spending a few minutes working on the entirety of your prep, then nothing is so valuable that it overrides players' choice. So yeah, less is more when you're prepping. If you'd like a link to this doc, it is available in my Patreon, as well as the editable version of it, the fillable version of this PDF, as well as a lot of other content like adventure modules, other DM prep guides, player guides, maps, all kinds of great stuff in that Patreon. So check it out if this is something that was interesting or helpful to you. Thank you for watching. See you next time.